So thank you very much for the nice introduction and the opportunity to give you some insights on our research. The presentation is titled Text Codex Library, the Sunte Marien Wortegarde between Institutional Practices and Literary History. Commonly, libraries are regarded as places where books are collected and made available for public use. But libraries are more than just collections of books. They are, as Andreas Speer puts it, spaces of thought and institutions of organized knowledge, spaces for thinking and orders of knowledge. In libraries, knowledge is not only collected, but also structured at the same time. We understand libraries as places where texts are constituted as objects of knowledge, both through material practices and through gestures of virtualization. Moreover, libraries are not just collections, but also instances of media transfer, for example, from parchment to paper, from manuscript to print and to book, and finally to digital media. Such transcriptive processes changes the status of a text and affects its reception just as much as the descriptive library practices. This leads us to the question, how and in what way libraries are involved in the constitution of texts of objects of knowledge. How and by what means they co-determine what is perceived a text and how this text is categorized.
By posing such questions, we firstly follow considerations concerning a praxeology of literary studies, as for example discussed by Martus and Spörhase. Secondly, we follow the suggestion of Michelle R. Warren, who in her book Holy Digital Grail traced the history of an Arthurian novel manuscript through its various historical media changes and transcriptions. In our example, we look at the practices which shaped the textuality of the uniquely transmitted Sunte Marien Wortegarde, a Marian poem of Könnemann von Jexheim. And we follow its manuscripts, the quarto-sized codex Manuscriptus Theologicus 153, on its journey throughout various libraries.
Before the Codex 153 came into the possession of Göttingen University Library, where it remains to this day, it belonged to several other libraries. The oldest evidence leads us to the private library of the Brunswick-Braunschweig town clerk Gavin of Hameln, whose book collection is considered as one of the most important private libraries of the 15th century in Germany. A total of 336 volumes were part of his library. After Gavin's death in 1496, they were donated to the Andreasbibliothek in Brunswick, under the condition that Gavin's collection would remain in Brunswick permanently and be accessible for experts. The fact that the Codex 153 belonged to Gavin's collection can be verified with some certainty. Gavin labeled all his manuscript and incunabula on the first written or printed page with his family crest, next to which the prayer petition Orate pro Gervino de Hamelin can be found. In our codex, where it can be found as well, it was supplemented by a later hand with datore, a donation record. The codex, marked by Gavin as an object of personal and family memory, hence becomes part of a hybrid collection of objects from different donors in the Andreana. Since the family crest can only be found on folio 1 of the codex, it can be assumed that the manuscript, which consists of 2 fascicles, was already bound together when it came into Gavin's possession, or that its parts were bound together by Gavin immediately after their acquisition. The fact that the 2 parts of the manuscript, it has the Latin and the vernacular part, were originally independent is shown by the staining seen on folio 1 recto as well as on folio 159, the beginning of the Wortegarde. This suggests that both parts must have been stored independently and unbound. The practice of binding that situates a text in a certain context and builds a framework for the way it's understood by placing it among its co-transmissions cannot be dated, but it can be, in principle, be proven. The context in which the text is placed corresponds to the profile of Gavin's library. According to Haukamp-Nass, it not only reflects Gavin's personal reading interests, which included theological literature such as sermons and texts on current theological debates, legal literature, medical writings, historiographical works, and scholastic literature. The desire for comprehensive educational opportunities was the determining factor for the interest in the collection, and the library can therefore be categorized as a library of practical works, a Gebrauchsbibliothek, which included the following thematic categories. Only 8 of the 359 texts in Gervin's library are in vernacular. These are primarily medical recipes, documents and legal writings, and geopolitical reports. The German texts in Codex 153 and the binding maculature of a Middle High German Romance are the only known evidence of vernacular poetry in this library. Aucamp therefore concludes that Gervin had no particular interest in literary texts and that the transmission of the Wortegarde and the text that follows it should be regarded merely as bycatch and coincidence. The Codex, which includes theological/religious works, texts related to the Council of Basel, and sermons in the Latin part, probably came into Gervin's possession because of its thematic profile. A personal interest can also serve as an explanation for the fact that the written traces of Gervin himself, whose handwriting is known from a memorial book, can only be found in the Latin but not in the vernacular part of the manuscript. Only in the first part of the Codex 153, as in other volumes of the library, marginal notes, annotations, and headings entered in Gervin's hand can be found. They assign addressable names to the texts, which in pre-modern times were often transmitted without, and also introduce the distinction between read and unread texts, as for example in Evangelium Nicodemi Legi. A total of 16 traces of Gervin's hand can be found in our codex, and the labeling on the bottom edge of the book, Theologia, not only indicates which way around the book might have been stored in its shelf in the library, but also assigns the text collection a thematic heading and a librarian classification. Considering the text preserved in the codex, such a classification is reasonable, and the current Göttingen shelf mark Codex Manuscriptus Theologicus 153 will take up the keyword theology once again. In addition to Gervin, there are traces of at least one other hand in both the Latin and vernacular fascicles of the codex. Unlike Gervin, this user is not content with inserting subheadings and marking text as read. In fact, structuring and maybe further reading, we have to check this out, marginal notes, annotations, highlights and maniculae, even corrections, etc. were left in the text. Those interventions can also be found in the Wortegarde. Verses were added, for example, in places where the rhyme scheme is broken, and corrections were made where scriptural errors were suspected. All these interventions show that this hand reshaped the Wortegarde according to aesthetic premises. For example, to write orphan rhymes as well as with regard to its own reading interest. The corrections and the addition of the verses in places where the rhyme scheme is interrupted, as well as the Latin glosses, establish additional textual structure to the poem and change its textuality. This new version of Könemann's poem is finally given a title with the Latin heading Viridarium Beate Virginis, meaning Garden of the Blessed Virgin, a translation of the vernacular metaphorical title mentioned in the epilogue. This title makes this version of the text addressable and distinguishable from the first-hand Wortegarde, and this necessarily means the first hand of the manuscript. Although Könemann also mentions himself in the epilogue, his name is not noted above the text.
But the Latin title, with its keyword of viridarium, does not only translate the metaphor of picking rhetorical flores, but also refers to a specific textual praxis and a text genre well established in the world of Latin script. It emphasizes the status of the Latin quotations in the text, the necessarily anonymous excerpt character of a poem, or to be more precise, of the poems in the second fascicle as a whole. Since all German texts of the manuscript share the same Mariological subject, and since they all carry Latin quotations, they all contribute to the viridarium, which in turn responds to the Mariological sermons of the Latin first part of the manuscript by surrounding the Latin quotations in praise of Mary with vernacular text.
At the end of the 17th century, the Helmstedt theologian Hermann von der Hart stated in a letter to Duke Rudolf August von Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel during a visit to the Andreasbibliothek, "Among many torn papers and volumes worn down by age, written many centuries ago, we have encountered not insignificant monuments." It was probably on von der Hart's initiative that some of the books were transferred to the reference library of Duke Rudolf August and later donated to the Helmstedt University Library. In addition, some books were also transferred to von der Hart's private library, including Codex 153. The reason why the Helmstedt professor transferred it from Gervin's library to his own is probably related to his research on the Council of Constance and Basel. Corresponding texts are also contained in Codex 153. A letter dated 11th October 1736 to an unknown recipient, which is bound at the beginning of the Codex, also proves that the Codex passed into possession of von der Hart. In this letter, Jakob Christian Hersenius thanks the recipient for having been given the manuscript and thus viridarium illud Konemanianum Beate Mariae Virginis. Hersenius not only read Konemann's Wortegarde, but also made a copy of it, which originally belonged to the collection of the Gymnasialbibliothek, grammar school library, in Salzwedel, and now is part of the holdings of the Berlin State Library. In the preface to this copy of the Wortegarde, he states that the source of his copy is a 15th century manuscript that belonged to Hermann von der Hart's library in Helmstedt in 1736.
In this copy, Hersenius isolates the text of the second fascicle from the composite manuscript. He transcribes both the German and the Latin text element, normalizing and expanding the abbreviations, but only the German verses are numbered consecutively in the margin of each respective column. In the transcription, the Wortegarde appears now as a numerical quantity whose components can be addressed individually, and it is now conceived of as a coherent entity. But this coherent entity is a German text to which the Latin elements are only supplementary. Since Hersenius seems to be mainly interested in the German dialect, he only examines the vernacular elements from an almost philological point of view. This first proto-philological doppelganger of the Wortegarde arises through a decidedly material practice, yet it employs a gesture of virtualization. It drafts a text that historically did not exist in this form, but that will nonetheless determine both the following editions and the descriptions of literary history. The only printed edition of the text prepared by Ludwig Wolff in 1953 follows this principle. It presents a cleansed, Low German text, and Wolff's approach continues to drive virtualization forward in awarding a new status to the uniquely transmitted 15th century text, which is now thought of as a copy that is separated by several, albeit only deduced intermediate copies from the original written in 1304. Furthermore, the text as a numerical order gains new relevance in Wolff's edition, since he assumes that there had been a mix-up of sheets in the template manuscript for Codex 143, which led to an error in the first order. Wolff rearranges the text according to the supposedly correct sequence. While those philological transcriptions of Hersenius and Wolff shaped the uniformity and coherence of the text, the descriptive practices of the libraries focused on the creation of an authorial text.
After the death of Hermann von der Hart in 1746, his library was given to his nephew Anton Julius von der Hart. After he died, the library was auctioned off in 1786. The auction catalogue by Paul Jakob Bruns contains a full list of the books sorted by languages. The Codex 153 was categorized as a Latin manuscript. Bruns organized them according to material and format and differentiates them according to their contents: manuscript, which mainly contains texts on the Council of Constance and Basel, manuscripts from Hermann von der Hart's personal possession of the Council of Basel, other writings from the period before and after the 16th century. The Codex 153 is categorized as other writings, although it contains texts on the Council of Basel. Hence, what might have particularly interested Hermann von der Hart about the Codex seems to be of secondary importance in this new description of the Codex. Bruns's entry lists the text it contains using the headings added to the Codex by Gerwin and the second hand. A reference to the language and the actual date of the composition of the text, February 1304, is added to the Wortegarde. The other vernacular texts, which are not provided with any heading by any hand, are referred to simply as aliud poema similis argumenti eadem lingua. From this moment on, the Sunte Marien Wortegarde, written around the middle of the 15th century, is regarded in his library catalogues as a text from 1304. According to a catalogue of acquisitions and donations to the Göttingen University Library, the library acquired the Codex 153 together with 70 other volumes from von der Hart's library. The first cataloguing from Göttingen focuses on the previous owner of the object, who only appeared incidentally in today's description. In 1786, it constituted the address for our codex and its texts. This changed in 1893 with the reorganization and redescription of Göttingen manuscripts by Wilhelm Meyer, who listed our manuscript as under the shelf mark Theol 153. Meyer dates the manuscript to the 15th century for the first time and specifies the Latin abbreviation German as late medieval Low German. Accordingly, Meyer lists the poem as Sunte Marien Wortegarde. In contrast to the auction catalogue, the vernacular texts are now referred to at the beginning of the description and appear as essential parts of the manuscript. This also includes the text categorized as aliud poema. Not only are titles given to them, but also, where possible, missing authors' parallel transmissions are added.
The texts that follow the Wortegarde are now being given their due in terms of literary history, insofar as they are understood as excerpts and witnesses of independent poems. As a result, the idea that the Wortegarde and the excerpt section belong together, as seemed to be implied in the phrase similis argumenti eadem lingua, is abandoned. Similarities and analogies in this viridarium of associated vernacular text are neglected in favor of literary differentiation.
It is striking that in Meyer's entry for the Wortegarde nevertheless quotes both the Latin praise of wisdom, indicating the use of red ink, and the first vernacular verses that follows this praise. In Meyer's understanding, the Latin and vernacular elements do constitute the text of Körnemann's poetry, and the bilingualism is therefore co-determining for its textuality. The entry is concluded by quotations from the epilogue, naming the vernacular title, the verses from which the time and place of composition emerge, and the explicit, again with reference to the red ink for the Latin parts, in which the writer names himself. The 8 following writer's verses are omitted, but the amen at the end is quoted. By citing as what is understood to be the beginning and the end of the text, the boundaries of the text are defined and recorded here for the first time. While Meyer's catalogue was aiming at taking inventory of all medieval manuscripts in Göttingen, in 1903 the Königlich Preußische Akademie der Wissenschaften, the Royal Prussian Academy of Sciences, initiated a plan to set up an archive of description of German-language medieval manuscripts in Berlin in order to tackle the lack of knowledge about medieval vernacular manuscripts. In a memorandum classified as secret, the lack of editions of medieval German texts from the year after 1250 was criticized, as well as the lack of knowledge about which manuscript had been transmitted at all, making it impossible to comprehensively analyze the history of German literature and language. For this reason, it was decided that all vernacular texts, codices, and fragments should be fully catalogued in philological, codicological, and literary historical terms, and the Berlin Handschriftenarchiv HSA was created alongside the edition series Deutsche Texte des Mittelalters DTM. Both are continued to this day at the Berlin-Brandenburgischen Akademie der Wissenschaften. In 1903-1904, principles for the inventory of German manuscript of the Middle Ages and the early New High German period were published for the HSA. They were reissued several times until 1944 and served as a template for the guidelines for manuscript cataloging of the German Research Foundation, first published in 1963. In addition to the shelf mark of the manuscript, the entries should include information of provenance, materiality, paleography, size and format, page layout and decoration, binding and watermarks. A list of the relevant contents should be made, staining the leaves and citing the beginning and the end of the text. Furthermore, headings, marginalia, and/or other traces of uses should be recorded. Shorter, previously unprinted text with up to approximately 20 verses should be copied in full. There even are guidelines on formalities and paper quality, amtliches deutsches Normalpapierqualität 2a, and regulations on the use of Latin and German script and ink color, as we will see shortly. Also, the corpus relevant for the German studies is defined. It includes manuscripts up to the year 1520, which contains vernacular texts and are considered as being literary in the sense of the 19th and 20th century. In 1911, Ludwig Pfannmüller starts his description of Codex 153 with the metadata, signature, information on the age and materiality of the manuscript, including a sketch of the watermark, you can see it in the middle, the extent, the format, and a reference to the two original independent parts. Furthermore, information on the hands, the binding, the page layout and decoration, the book binding can also be found here. Corresponding to the occasion, the vernacular texts appear prioritized over the Latin texts, which Pfannmüller simply refers to as lateinische Prosastücke, Latin pieces in prose. According to the guidelines, all these informations are written in German script in order to distinguish it from everything that was taken verbatim from the codex in Latin script. On pages 2 recto and 3 recto, the Wortegarden is described, listed as Konnemanns Wurzgarten. The heading Viridarium Beate Virginis is labeled as inserted by a later hand. Pfannmüller records the text boundaries of the Wortegarden in accordance with the guidelines. Although he transcribes the Latin praise of wisdom at the beginning of the text diplomatically and according to the codex in red ink, he only marks the two vernacular phases in black as Anfang, beginning. For him, the actual text is the German one, to which the Latin verses are subordinated as accessories. The Latin quotation, which previously constituted the existence of the text as a viridarium, now appears secondary, relegated to the status of paratexts. Looking at the description of the text following the Wortegarden, it becomes clear that the Latin entries, which can also be found there, are treated differently. Although all vernacular texts have the interweaving of Latin and Low German elements in common, their status, their belonging to the text, is defined differently from one work to another. The guiding factor seems to be a direct reference of the German text to the Latin excerpt.
The way the end of the Wortegarden is handled by Pfannmüller also draws a new distinction concerning the boundaries of the text. While he copies the verses in which the name of a scribe, Johannes schreef mich, Johann scribed me, appears, the following 8 verses are not quoted. This approach differentiates what is generally referred to as the writer's verse from Konnemann's text and marks it as an addition. The text that is thus constituted is a vernacular author's text from which the Latin material as well as the verses added by a writer can be distinguished as supplements or addenda. In this form, as a discernible early 14th century Low German poem that can be attributed to a specific author and that has been copied at some point by a scribe named Johannes and incorporated into our codex in the mid-15th century, the text will enter the literary history of German studies. Its status as viridarium, as a collection of Latin excerpts embellished by a poetic commentary, which responds to the theological Latin texts of the first fascicle, and which is followed by similis argumenti e adem lingua, falls into oblivion. We see the digital edition we are working on as an opportunity to critically reflect on the historical processuality of a text with its different forms of virtualization. We thus propose to understand digital editions not only as an improvement of philological historical editing, but as an opportunity to represent text as objects of knowledge that extend in time and are constantly being reconstituted. The next step in our project will address the descriptions of literary history as another way to shape the text and the textual status of it. Thank you.